Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Buckeye Politics. Today, I will be talking about how, based off of polling data, Republicans and Trump are actually in a much better position now than they were in 2022. But before we get into that, if you're new, please be sure to like and subscribe. We're hopefully going to come out with a couple different videos before the election. I hope to upload more frequently over the next few weeks because there is a lot that is going on, obviously, with the election less than a month away now. So we got to really start putting out some videos. So, let's get into it though. So I have seen a lot of people talk about how since Republicans underperformed the polls in 2022, it means that Trump is going to lose in 2024. So first of all, I think it's very difficult to compare presidential elections to midterms. Turnout is much different, and there are a lot more factors at play like state and local issues. But in any case, people tend to still make that comparison. People also tend to overstate how well Republicans were actually polling ahead of 2022. And as we'll see shortly, in a lot of races, they were actually losing well into October, and the polls ended up being accurate if you looked at them about a month out. And people forget that Republicans surged later in the election season, especially late October, early November. And that was most likely because a lot of Democrats vote early, and they were not considered likely voters in the polls conducted later because they already voted. Obviously, there's a lot of different reasons that the polls were off. Turnout was a huge factor amongst kind of the Trump base. There were also a pretty big surge in suburban women turning out for Democrats because of the abortion issue. But still, the reason that polling was off, more or less, I would say, is because so many Democrats voted early. And that's not going to be as big a factor this cycle because, as we've seen, Democrats have actually been turning out in terms of mail-in voting at slightly lower rates than they were in 2022. Republicans, especially in like Pennsylvania, are doing fairly well. But still, the reason that the polls overestimated Republicans later in the cycle is because Democrats voted early. So we'll start in Arizona, just kind of looking at this a little bit more in more detail. So currently in the state of Arizona, according to 538, Donald Trump holds about a 1.4% lead. He is at 48.2%. Kamala Harris is at 46.8%. He has maintained a narrow lead in polling pretty much this entire time. There's a little bit Harris took the lead about a month ago, but that's about it. If we go to the Arizona governor race in 2022 and go back to this exact date, Katie Hobbs was leading in the polls by 0.2%. Obviously, a little bit after this, Kari Lake had a massive surge. She led in the polls by about 2.5 points, and she ended up losing. And this is a race that a lot of people are comparing to 2024 because they're saying, oh, well, Trump is leading in the polls now. Doesn't that mean he's going to lose because the polls had Kari Lake winning? But you have to remember Arizona is a state with a lot of older voters, people who vote early. So the polls earlier on actually makes more sense that they were relatively accurate. Republicans tend to vote more on election day. Democrats tend to vote more early. So, and the polls were actually, it's very interesting how accurate they were in Arizona. Katie Hobbs led by 0.2 about a month out on this exact date. She ended up winning by 0.67, so less than half a point off. And this is in a state that, I mean, the polling industry tends to just, has not been accurate the last few cycles. So the fact that it was this close a month out is very interesting and a good sign. If we go to the Senate race, we see a very similar story. The polls going into election day had Mark Kelly leading by about 1.5, but about a month out on October 9th, this exact date, he was leading by 5.7. He ended up winning this race by 4.9, as I'll show right here, real quickly. Yeah, he won by 4.9. So the polls, about a month out, underestimated Republicans actually by about a point or so, a little bit less. So if you want to look at it that way, I mean, you could say, well, Republicans should overperform the polls. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying this is even the best way to predict elections, but I am saying that if you want to take this and compare the data from 2022 to 2024, it actually does not look that bad for Republicans. We'll switch over to the state of Georgia now, looking at the presidential race there. Trump leads by about 1 point. He leads 48.3 to 47.3 to Kamala Harris. Polling in Georgia has kind of been all over the place. There's been a couple of polls that have Trump up by like 5 or 6, a bunch of polls that have it even, but Trump overall has maintained a solid lead in polling, although there have been a few that have been good for Harris. But Trump has been polling fairly well in Georgia. He currently has a 1-point lead. If we compare that to the Georgia Senate race in 2022, we got to go to the general election. Herschel Walker led in the final aggregate by about a point. So once again, you have people saying, well, look, Republicans led by a point in the final aggregate. They lost by about 3. That means Trump is going to lose. But if you go back to this date on October 9th, Raphael Warnock led by 3.7 points. And that was about a point off the final aggregate, actually underestimated Republicans by about a point. And there's a couple different reasons that Herschel Walker was just a poor candidate for the state. So this might not be the best example. I think Arizona is a better example of this. But still, if you want to compare the two, in Georgia, I mean, polling about a month out was pretty much exactly accurate. Trump leads by about a point in Georgia. So if you want to compare the polls from 2022 to 2024, Trump is actually doing fairly well in the Sun Belt. We'll look at one last state, and that is the state of Nevada, where Kamala Harris currently holds about a 0.8 lead, and in the governor race there in 2022, the Republicans is the one seat Republicans actually flipped. But about a month out, on October 9th, they had Joe Lombardo leading by 0.9. So this race was razor thin. It was still very much competitive. And just a few weeks ago, Steve Sisolak, the incumbent, was leading by about 0.3. Lombardo had a big surge. He ended up leading by almost 2 points. He ended up winning by, if we go to the governor race really quickly here, he ended up winning by about 1.5. So polling was actually relatively accurate in Nevada, but about a month out, it slightly underestimated Republicans. Republicans outperformed how they were polling on earlier in the season. And if we compare that to now, Kamala Harris leads by 0.9. So if we're going to compare the polling misses from 2022 to 2024, Donald Trump should actually very narrowly flip the state of Nevada, which I'm not saying he will. I think Nevada is going to actually be a pretty difficult state for Trump to flip. But if we want to compare the polling errors when the polls were most accurate, because there wasn't all messed up because of mail-in voting and Democrats voting early, so they weren't actually counted as likely voters, the polls are razor thin, with Trump having a slight advantage across the Sun Belt. So, once again, I want to say this is not the best way to look at the data, but this is kind of just to debunk the narrative that, oh, Republicans are polling very well in certain states. They were also polling well in 2022. That means they're going to lose. Well, not necessarily. There's a lot more that goes into it. So, I want to thank you all for watching this video. I want to ask you to like and subscribe for more, and I will see you in the next one.